Hello, I'm Chris, and I'm reading the Claremont Run. So, the Claremont Run is a 16-ish year period of X-Men comics written by Chris Claremont, spanning from 1975 to 1991. Even if you're not super familiar with that or with the comics in general, you've probably heard of some of the stories and characters that he created. So, for example, this is where the Dark Phoenix saga originates, which has been kind of in every X-Men adaptation put to screen, as well as Days of Future Past. And he created characters such as Rogue, Mystique, Emma Frost, Kitty Pryde, Moira McTaggart, Gambit, Jubilee. And he writes all his characters with an unprecedented level of humanity and real compelling emotional continuity, especially his female characters. They have an unprecedented level of agency, even for comics today sometimes. And so that's part of why I wanted to delve into this. So, what I want to do today is talk about a brief history of comics, the X-Men, a bit about Claremont himself, as well as my relationship to the source material. So right now, I'm about 6 years into reading the run. So it's kind of weird to make these like giant sweeping introductory statements about something that I don't have the full scope of, but I have read enough of it at this point to know that I really want to do a video series on the Claremont Run. So I've been sort of taking notes as I go, and basically I'll start with history this episode, and then next video kind of go into the characters and the first like giant size X-Men introduction, and then from there kind of take it story arc by story arc, issue by issue, and do a whole series on the Claremont Run. I'm just excited to talk about it, honestly. I only have so many people in my life that are willing and or able to talk about X-Men for so long. So this seemed like a fun way to do that. And I watch a ton of video essays. I love that as a format. I love so many of the creators out there doing that. And so it seemed like a fun way to put that back out into the world. And I've always loved the X-Men for the same reason that a lot of people do, honestly. They've always been kind of representative of a certain otherness that can be interpreted as an allegory for many different identities and marginalized groups. But their stories have always been kind of more flawed and human and dealing with interpersonal relationships and found family. So that can be kind of comforting. And from a whimsical perspective, I always really liked all their different powers and stuff. It's just really fun. Honestly, the fights are so inventive because they have so many different types of powers that go about attacking each other in different ways. So it's kind of fun in that way too, as well as, the more human element. So before really delving into comic history itself, I just want to give a shout out and like a thank you acknowledgement to my good friend Jacob Cordes. He's an amazing writer and a comic expert, and he helped me clarify a lot of the points in this, and I was able to talk with him about a lot of it, and he helped me get into comics in the first place. I think if all the comic fans out there were like him, there would be no gatekeeping and everybody would feel that it was an accessible thing to get into. So I'm really grateful for him, and I wanted to make sure I shouted him out. So there are a few ways to kind of break down the eras of comic history. The approach that I'm taking is going to be more like smaller eras, a little more nuanced. And there are a ton of sources and a ton of places that help me research this. So I'll put a link to all those. If you're interested, you can learn more and visit some of those websites too. So starting just briefly with the Platinum Age, that is from 1897 to 1938, and this is really the era of like newspaper comics. So the first like actual comic book does kind of come out in this era. It's like a reprint compilation kind of all these newsstand like strip comics. But you do see kind of some of the first original material. And the early 1930s is really when it starts to reflect some of what we see today. Also, during the Great Depression, it was a form of like cheaper entertainment than the movies or something like that. So I think it was probably more popular as a result of that. So next comes the Golden Age, which is 1938 to 1947. And this features a lot of the like classic heroes that we know today. So the late 30s is also when DC and Marvel kind of, as they weren't necessarily known with that name at that time, but what ends up being DC and Marvel start publishing comics in the late 30s. And this era, 1938, marks the debut of Superman. It also sees the debut of Wonder Woman, Captain America, Batman, and Namor during this time period. And initially, actually, in the first years of publication, kind of like just the first couple years until the 40s, they were a little more like pulpy and vengeful, like not the wholesome heroes that we think of as being kind of the golden age hero. Then comics and superheroes in particular were largely co-opted as propaganda during World War II. There was even the Writers' War Board, which was a government agency that helped create comic storylines to be more like patriotic and friendly to their agenda. And honestly, it worked. I mean, in 1944, about 44% of the men in the armed forces identified as avid comic readers. And while I am generally always averse to especially war-related government propaganda sneaking its way into art and media like that, we did get this Captain America punching Hitler, so that's nice. But post-war, superheroes kind of fell out of favor. I mean, it's easy to see why. We start to see in their place things like westerns, romance, crime thrillers, a lot of sci-fi, and horror. So this takes us to the atomic age, also sometimes known as the television age, since home televisions are more accessible and some of the popular genres are mimicking popular television genres. The atomic age spans from 1948 to 1955, and comics during this time start to do a lot of like kind of weird and subversive stuff. So, I mean, you still see shitty stuff like racist caricatures and sexism and glorified violence against women, but you also see some really unique storytelling, especially in the kind of sci-fi, horror, and fantasy genres. Scientific advancements and also like the horrors of nuclear warfare start to kind of impact this period too. EC Comics, which originally began as educational comics, but was changed to entertaining comics once William Gaines, the son of the founder, took over the company after his father died in like a freak boating accident, I think, in 1947. And they were doing a lot of this kind of stuff. They overtly questioned social and political norms at the time. Their stories deconstructed racism, drug use, anti-Semitism, police corruption, sexism, and the post-war American ideals in general. So their stories include the Tales from the Crypt series, and they frequently utilized twist endings and subverting expectations. Just kind of looking it up, it reminded me a little bit of the Twilight Zone, almost kind of like a proto version of that. However, EC Comics did not last long into the Silver Age, which spans from 1956 to 1970. As comics get more risque, more subversive, and more violent, particularly the horror comics, there's this huge backlash and moral panic about it. In 1954, psychiatrist Frederick Wertham publishes his book Seduction of the Innocent, which basically makes a case that comics are causing juvenile delinquency and are detrimental to youth. The same year, there is a Senate subcommittee hearing on juvenile delinquency, and the Comic Code Authority is born. Basically, the Comic Code Authority, the CCA, is just a bunch of nonsense that heavily censors comics, and the publishers that didn't adhere to this couldn't really sell their comics like on the newsstand, which is where they were being mostly sold. And honestly, it sounds really similar to the Hays Code, which was a censorship guidelines for film and cinema at that time that was just racist, sexist, homophobic, pro-authority nonsense. Specific rules of the Hays Code were like no interracial couples, no, making police look bad, no making criminals look human or relatable. And so while the Hays Code was a little more like racism, the CCA seemed a little more like racism. Some of the other specific rules of the Comic Code, and I'll put them up on the screen, you can also look them up, but some specific things were no profanity, obscenity, smut, vulgarity, no vampires, ghouls, or werewolves, No scenes of horror, excessive bloodshed, gory or gruesome crimes, depravity, lust, sadism, masochism, and it codified that criminals are not to be glamorized, and policemen, judges, government officials, and respected institutions shall never be presented in a way as to create disrespect for established authority. And that goes on for a while. Like, it's revised in 1971, and I'll talk about why, but it's not until 2001 that Marvel completely bypasses it, and not until 2011 that DC does the same. One super notable case of the CCA being used as a force of racism is in 1956, when EC Comics wants to reprint a story that they actually already ran in 1953 before the code was in effect. And this is 1956. They're reprinting it as part of like a sci-fi compilation compendium. It's called Judgment Day, and it features a human astronaut who goes to another planet as a representative of the Galactic Republic, and he sees that like the robots of the planet are segregated based on their color, even though they're basically the same, with one group given fewer rights than another. So he denies the planet admission to the Republic until they resolve their bigotry, and the last panel, he removes his helmet, and it reveals him to be a black man. So, of course, the administrator of the comic code, Judge Charles Murphy, was like, and I took that personally. Murphy was super racist, and he demanded that the astronaut not be a person of color. And the writer of the story, Al Feldstein, recalls this conversation. We said it can't be a black person. So I said, for God's sake, Judge Murphy, that's the whole point of the goddamn story. So he said, no, it can't be a black. Bill Gaines called him up later and raised the roof. Finally, they said, well, you gotta take the perspiration off. I had the stars glistening and the perspiration on his black skin. Bill said, fuck you, and hung up. So EC Comics ran this anyway, without the code. But between that and the censorship of the code in general, EC went under not long after. So even if the code didn't explicitly ban representation of people of color, the people upholding it did, and it's no surprise that you see this have sort of a chilling effect on representation in comics for a really long time. Also, just kind of more humorous side note, during the kind of initial committee with the CCA, they showed this like horror cover of a woman's severed head, and they asked Bill Gaines, like, do you think this is in good taste? And he replied, yes, sir, I do. For the cover of a horror comic. A cover in bad taste, for example, might be defined as holding the head a little higher so the neck could be seen dripping blood from it, and moving the body over a little further so the neck of the body could be seen to be bloody. So getting into the Silver Age, this is when we start to see characters like The Flash, Fantastic Four, Spider-Man, Aquaman, Green Arrow, and the Justice League, as well as our X-Men in 1963. It starts in 1956 when The Flash is introduced. That's kind of the definitive start point for this era. And it goes until around 1970. So superheroes are back, baby. Yeah. The censorship from the comic code really cleared the runways for an era of more wholesome heroics, and a ton of new characters and ideas emerged during this time, like in the superhero world. So although relative to the Golden Age, these characters are more flawed and human than in the past, especially when Marvel saw Stan Lee as the editor-in-chief in the 60s. So you can really see characters also more involved in science, especially in an optimistic way, and kind of interacting with space in that way as well. However, people are becoming more and more disillusioned throughout the 60s. You see Kennedy assassinated in 1963. The Vietnam draft starts in 1964. And so by the end of the decade, people are back from war. There are huge strides made from civil rights, but not without a lot of violence and hatred and backlash. Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act are passed in 1964, but I mean, obviously that didn't fix racism, so that's a big issue during this time too. So basically all those things kind of take us into a more hardened Bronze Age, which spans from 1970 to 1985. During this time, we get more anti-heroes like the Punisher or Conan the Barbarian, more relevant social issues, more subversive elements in the stories that are being told. And we also get a little more diversity with characters like the Black Panther getting more of their own stories. There's even one where he fights the KKK. The Comics Code is also revised in 1971, which is interesting because the Hays Code was abolished right around the same time in 1968. Although, that after that was abolished, the Motion Pictures Association came and kind of vaguely rated and censored stuff too. So it's not like it was all free and great, but just kind of goes to show a changing sentiment in culture. So the code is revived. It was a little less no werewolves, and allowed more supernatural elements like monsters and vampires and ghouls, as long as they were handled in the classic tradition, kind of like the literary Frankenstein and Dracula. It also, notably, allowed the portrayal of drugs and narcotics, but only if it's portrayed as a vicious habit. There were a lot of guidelines about that. And it was actually a direct result of The Amazing Spider-Man in 1971. That year, the U.S. Department of Health, Education, and Welfare contacted Stan Lee to do an anti-drug story. And that didn't comply with the code, so Marvel just kind of bypassed it and ran it anyway, and it really highlighted the absurdity of the comic code itself. As Lee recalls, I could understand them. They were like lawyers, people who take things literally and technically. The code mentioned that you mustn't mention drugs. According to their rules, they were right. So I didn't even get mad at them. I said, screw it, and I took the code seal off for those 3 issues. Then we went right back to the code again. And later that same year, DC did a very similar themed issue with Green Arrow, Green Lantern. So now we have the Copper Age, also known as the Dark Age, from 1985 to 1991. And basically comics get super dark at this time, and they start appealing a lot more to older audiences. Stories are grittier, edgier, and more independent publishers gain traction during this time, and a lot of them just bypass the comic code completely, which at this point is definitely weakening and kind of pushes Marvel and DC to do the same and start doing edgier stuff too. Alan Moore and David Gibbons' Watchmen comes out in 1986, and we see a ton of anti-heroes and critiques of superheroes in general. And also kind of more fantasy and horror elements start coming back during this time too. Directly after this, we get
The Extreme Age
from 1992 to 1998. I do feel like I gotta start wearing sunglasses during this part. You can see the reflection of my phone. Okay. So this era can be summed up by the aesthetic sensibilities of Rob Liefeld. I think I'm saying that right. This is the time of excessive pockets and pouches, shiny clothes, and a fundamental misunderstanding of the human foot. Deadpool emerges during this time, as well as Cable, and we see a lot of crossover issues pretty constantly. There's a lot of gimmicky stuff to encourage the collector's market, like shiny covers and holographic stuff, but at this point it's pretty oversaturated. You see the rise of the bad girl and a lot of sexy femme fatale type characters. Examples of this would be Witchblade, Glory, Danger Girl, or even Vampirella. And in general, action movies and action stars are super popular, and that has a pretty evident effect on comics. Speaking of movies, this leads us to the movie age from 1998 until 2016. So in 1996, Marvel actually declares bankruptcy, so it's kind of fortunate for them that they started finding more success with their cinematic ventures not long after. Blade comes out in 1998, and that just really kicks things off. In 2000, the first X-Men comes out. Then in 2002, we get Blade, Spider-Man. 2003 is Daredevil, X2, and Hulk. 2004, The Punisher, Spider-Man 2, Blade Trinity. 2005 is Elektra and Fantastic Four. 2006 is X-Men, The Last Stand. 2007 is Ghost Rider, Spider-Man 3, Fantastic Four 2, Rise of the Silver Surfer. And 2008 is when Iron Man and The Incredible Hulk come out, kickstarting the MCU as we know it today. And I'm not going to keep reading the movie releases year by year because they're very substantial. Oh, it's also when Punisher Warzone comes out, but no one really cares about that. So in this time, comics influence movies, movies influence comics, which, positive or negative, it does make comics a lot more accessible in an interesting way, I think. I guess these were more from the recent past years, but I've seen a lot of like graphic novels based on Mara or Zatanna or Raven or a ton other ones that I'm not even thinking of, but appealing towards kind of younger female audiences, which is really cool. And I don't know if we would have gotten there without the movie age. So, bright side. So that brings us to now. Detouring back to the Silver Age, let's talk about X-Men's history specifically. So following the success of other titles at Marvel, like especially the Fantastic Four, it was created in 1963 by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, and it was not popular. Around 1970, they started not writing new issues anymore and just reprinting the old ones, and it really wouldn't find success until the Claremont Run. It was kind of on the verge of cancellation. So the starting lineup was Professor X, or Charles Xavier, Cyclops, Beast, Angel, Iceman, and Jean Grey as Marvel Girl with their long-running nemesis foe Magneto. And then in 1969, Havoc and Polaris were added as regulars to try to give it a boost, but that didn't really help. And side note, I'll go into more detail about these characters next time, so don't worry if you don't know exactly who they all are. And the reason they're mutants is interesting, actually. As Lee recalled in 2004, he said, "I couldn't have everybody bitten by a radioactive spider or exposed to gamma ray explosion. And I took the cowardly way out. I said to myself, why don't I just say they're mutants? They're born that way."
Rejoice and love yourself today, because baby, you were born this way.
So these early comics had a lot of kind of Cold War themes and suggested more mutant integration, compromise, servitude, assimilation, whereas later they're a little more like reflective and questioning the systems of power that have put them in this situation. I will be honest, I have not read these comics. I am already undertaking about 16 plus years of actually good comics to read, so I'm just kind of analyzing this from afar, but that's what I've gathered. Interestingly, the Doom Patrol from DC comes out about 3 months prior to X-Men and features a very similar premise. So there's a lot of speculation that the X-Men just totally ripped them off. And honestly, there are a lot of similarities between the two stories. Doom Patrol, if you're unfamiliar, is about a team of misfits with superpowers, originally written by Arnold Drake and Bob Haney, with artist Bruno Premiani. These characters live on the fringes of society, and a lot of their abilities are in some part due to experiments, accidents, or trauma in general. So while the mutants are definitely ostracized, marginalized, many of the X-Men in particular can usually pass for Homo sapien. They're physically attractive in general, and they live in upstate New York, and there's an element of wealth that they often seem to possess. So Doom Patrol is more of a representation of people who don't have a choice in how they're perceived, like people living with disabilities or disfigurement. And I'm not going to delve too deep into Doom Patrol right now, but I really love to do a video on them sometime in the future and just read it all, especially kind of as a contrast and complement to X-Men. So back to X-Men, it is relaunched in 1975, and that's where our run starts. By the 80s, it is the most popular comic around. So let's learn a little bit about the guy that gets us there. So Chris Claremont was born in London in 1950, which makes him just turned 72 right now. And at a pretty young age, he moved to the U.S., growing up in Long Island and then eventually going to college at Bard College in kind of upstate New York, where he majored in political theory and acting. As an undergrad, he got an assistant job at Marvel, and over time, he just started writing there more and more, kind of full-time, and they trusted him with more and more material. So in 1975, they gave him the Uncanny X-Men to write. It was relatively low risk for them since it didn't do super well before, and they were kind of like, here, you seem to like these guys. And he's only 25 at this point, which is just Jesus Christ. I'm older than that now. One really cool thing, so I'm an actor in film, theater, voiceover, and I especially appreciated this, that a lot of why he wrote such good, compelling, interesting characters was that he took kind of an actor's approach to writing them, which is so cool. Other people that worked with him said he was sort of like a method actor with these characters, and that explains why they have such an emotional through line. and like clear motivations, and they're like distinct kind of people. And I just think that's super neat. So as I was researching everything, I found this kind of interesting research paper called The Mutant Problem, X-Men, Confirmation Bias, and the Methodology of Comics and Identity by Martin Lund. In it, it says, the X-Men, created by Jewish American comics legends Stan Lee and Jack Kirby in 1963, is a team of mutants, a class of human being first introduced as people that possess an extra power, one which ordinary humans do not. Especially after the introduction of the mutant hunting robot Sentinels in X-Men 14, November 1965, Marvel Comics mutants have been increasingly inscribed with an allegorical otherness. They have been subject to many of the prejudices that have historically plagued marginalized minorities, including, among other things, forced and voluntary segregation, slurs, persecution, and genocidal campaigns, and conspiracy theories about their aims as a group. And that's really a compelling thing for me about mutants, is kind of how they can serve as an allegory for so many different marginalized groups, and that our perception of their identity can vary kind of depending on our own lived experiences as well as that of the writer. Stan Lee and Jack Kirby are both Jewish Americans, kind of as is Chris Claremont. His mom was Jewish, so at least on his mother's side. And there are explicit parallels to Jewishness and Jewish identity in the storylines, especially when you get to the genocidal aims of the Sentinels and the mutant registry that's in effect at one point. They also reflect, in that way, other groups, the Japanese concentration camps, the treatment of indigenous people in this country for centuries. The treatment of mutants is also a direct allegory for racial discrimination. As Lee himself says, it occurred to me that instead of them just being heroes that everybody admired, what if I made people fear and suspect and actually hate them because they were different? I loved that idea. It not only made them different, but it was a good metaphor for what was actually happening with the civil rights movement in the country at that time. Personally, though, I have always perceived X-Men through the lens of queerness. Mutants usually manifest their powers around puberty, often during like a first kind of intimate encounter like Rogue does. And I think I perceived them also that way because homophobia was sort of the first form of like unfounded hatred that I had personal experience with, having it directed at me as well as the people I cared about. So my mom is a high school teacher, and she was very active in like the Gay Straight Alliance at her high school that she taught at, as well as GLSEN, which is like a Gay and Lesbian Educators Network. I'll put up exactly what it stands for, but I remember we would march in the Pride Parade with GLSEN with the other teachers and stuff, and it was so cool. I loved being there in that environment, and I remember being so shocked and terrified by the people on the side of the road holding signs telling us that we were going to hell. Just complete hatred and very violent statements. And I'm bi or pan. I don't really have a specific label that I'm like attached to, but basically I'm kind of attracted to people regardless of gender. So when I'm dating a man or someone male presenting, like, I am now, I can kind of easily pass for straight, kind of like when the mutants can pass, and them grappling with their identity in that way. That was always interesting to me personally. And when I've dated someone femme presenting, I've faced a lot of judgment and fetishization when we've been out together. So that was definitely my kind of attachment to the X-Men's otherness. And the early 2000s movies definitely steered into that.
So, when did you first know you were
a mutant? We just didn't realize
We still love you, Bobby.
So I'm looking forward to analyzing the Claremont Run with that in mind as well. So that's the video. Like I said, next time I'll be probably analyzing like the giant X-Men and going into each of the specific characters, kind of their in-story information, as well as a little bit about how they were created and stuff when that's applicable. So thanks for watching if you watched this far. Again, I'm Chris, and I'll see you next time.